Yes, good evening friends. On behalf of Maadhavi classes, I, Rajiv Ranjan, initiate you into your essay paper, English medium for your BPSC मेंस एग्जामिनेशन. और आज हम लोग जो टॉपिक डिस्कस करेंगे, अगेन इट इज़ वेरी वेरी इम्पॉर्टेंट इन टुडेज कंडीशंस, एंड दैट इज द चेंजिंग जियोस्ट्रैटेजिक इक्वेशंस ऑफ द वर्ल्ड. ठीक है, द चेंजिंग geostrategic equations of the world. जियोस्ट्रैटेजिक का तो मतलब ही होता है वर्ल्ड, लेकिन फिर भी एक ओवर एलाबोरेशन मैंने कर लिया. अब जैसा कि मेरी आपकी बात हो चुकी है, an essay traditionally consists at the BPSC mains level of 700 to 800 words. Right? Friends, when we talk about 700 to 800 words of the essay as a whole, तो हम लोग को मालूम है कि उसका इंट्रोडक्शन पार्ट जो है, इंट्रोडक्शन is about 100 to 120 words. अब मैं आपको इंट्रोडक्शन शुरू करता हूं, प्लीज. हाँ, पोस्ट सेकेंड वर्ल्ड वॉर, with the evolution of the United Nations organization as a global peacemaking body and its myriad agencies as making an endeavor to bring about the socio-economic and cultural transformation of the world, we find is accompanied by a bipolar world epitomized by the emergence of the capitalist bloc led by the United States of America on one hand and the communist bloc comprising of the Warsaw Pact countries led by the USSR on the other hand. In addition to this, we had the third dimension of the non-aligned countries who deemed it prudent not to openly align with either of the power blocs and charter their own middle path in the global situation. The world as it evolved after the Second World War was a world torn by a devastating 6 years war which was pan-global and mostly comprised of neo-independent countries in Asia, Africa, and to a smaller extent in the Latin American countries, which had borne slavery, servitude, colonialism, and imperialism for a period of over 200 years, and this debilitated their growth as a modern country. तो ये आपका इंट्रोडक्शन हो गया. अब आइए मेन बॉडी. द मेन बॉडी this consists of 500 to 600 words. And as I told you, the main body is actually an elaboration an expostulation of the main points that are put before you in your introduction. For about 40 years to 45 years, I am now dictating you the main body, For about 40 to 45 years after the Second World War, the world was essentially a bipolar world with frequent cases of the two mega power blocks, that is the United States of America and the Soviet Union, coming face to face with one another in different theaters of the world. Immediately after the Second World War, the Korean War saw a confrontation between these two ideological blocs, with North Korea subscribing to the communist allegiance and South Korea a firm ally of the United States of America. Then we had the 1948-49 Arab-Israel War, immediately following the formation of the new Jewish state of Israel, wherein the United States of America, Britain and France, they aligned with Israel, and the Arab nations as a whole, Libya, Jordan, Egypt, Syria, Morocco, they had the sympathies of the then Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. A couple of years later, in 1956, we had the Suez Crisis, in which once again the Western Bloc, especially led by Britain and France, was pitted against the United Arab Emirates, whose president Gamal Al Nasser was a friend of the USSR. Somehow the crisis was tided over and the world remained safe more than ever. In the mid-1950s, to be very precise, in 1954-55, we had the specter of the Vietnam War, where the North Vietnam region was backed by the communist bloc led by the USSR, China, etc. And South Vietnam, once again a firm ally of the United States of America and a subscriber of the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, SEATO. Things continued like this. Once again, in the Yom Kippur War between Israel and Arabs, in the Iran-Iraq War, in the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan, and several cases of leftist insurgents all over the world, especially the shining path of Peru, the left extremists in Venezuela, and other places of Latin America. This is not to undermine the important Cuba Missile Crisis, which almost pushed the world on the threshold of another world war, wherein the belligerence, the communist belligerence was of Khrushchev, was countered by the calm perseverance and statesmanship of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the President of the United States of America, and the world was safe from a nuclear disaster. Friends, in addition to this, there was the third bloc exemplified in the non-aligned movement, which had its genesis in the Bandung Conference of 1955, wherein Nehru expostulated his diplomatic theory of the golden mean, the middle path, and emphasized the fact that the world need not be, the countries, the third world countries need not be a member of either of the power blocs. Though Nehru was castigated for his initiative, and when the non-aligned movement was finally put in place at the Belgrade Conference in 1961 with Marshal Joseph Broz Tito of Yugoslavia, Gamal Al Nasser of Egypt, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru of India, and backed by lesser global leaders who were equally wedded and committed to the cause of non-alignment, like Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, Kenneth Kaunda of Zambia, Kenneth Kaunda of Zambia, Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya, Milton Obote of Uganda, etc., etc. They all formed an alliance or a grouping of countries which tried to steer clear of this bipolar confrontation of the power blocs. Though the then American Secretary of State under President Dwight D. Eisenhower, John Foster Dulles, called the non-aligned movement an amorous movement, yet the fact stands that the non-aligned movement created non-bellicose, peaceful, and a forward developing environment of cooperation and goodwill between the newly independent nations of Asia and Africa. Friends, however, things began to change from the late 1990s, when Mikhail Gorbachev became the president of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. He ushered in the policy of glasnost and perestroika, and that brought about the dismantling of the Soviet Union. With the dismantling of the Soviet Union, many refractionist movements began to creep up in communist bloc countries like the Solidarity movement in Poland, then movement of resurgence against communist dictatorships in Romania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, East Germany, etc. The German unification of 1990 did the rest. Once East and West Germany united, the communist East Germany simply faded into the overall capitalist German nation. Friends, with the dismantling of the Soviet bloc countries, the breaking of the so-called Iron Curtain, which Winston Churchill had once said, the world became unipolar, and Uncle Sam, that is the United States of America, began to dictate terms, especially during the US-Iraq war, the Gulf War, Operation Desert Storm, wherein Iraqis were killed like guinea pigs and American lethal weapons were tested on them. But then, this scenario continued till the opening years of the 21st century. However, Adita or a bonhomie began to operate even between the United States of America and Soviet Union. The Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, etc. were put in place so that the two countries could cooperate in a spirit of détente and make the world more safe and worth living. However, this period, once United States of America saw that the Soviet bloc had disintegrated and the threat of a bipolar world no longer existed, then the traditional military alliances began to be weakened. The Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, which was formed with the United States of America, UK, France, Australia, New Zealand, Pakistan and Philippines and Thailand, in 1954 with its headquarters in Bangkok, was simply dissolved in 1977 on the plea that it is no more needed in the changed strategic conditions of the world. Similarly, the Central Treaty Organization, CENTO, which was formed between Iran, Iraq, Pakistan, Turkey, UK and the USA in 1955 under the Baghdad Pact, was dissolved in 1979. Once again on the plea that the world has become unipolar and there is no need for these defense treaties. Similarly, once the world became unipolar, non-aligned movement also began to lose its relevance. And also the Asia-African Economic Cooperation, it became weakened and was replaced more or less by the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, as we call it today. Regional blocs which had developed like South Asian Cooperation for Regional Cooperation SAARC also began to weaken. But friends, after the opening decades of the 21st century, things began to change. Once it was seen that the US is trying to dictate the global matters for its own partition gains, the countries which were evolving on the threshold of being developed countries like India, South Africa, China, Brazil, they began to clamor for a greater share in the global affairs, especially in the restructuring of the United Nations Organization and the restructuring of the Security Council. Friends, with this once again, small weak efforts in bipolarism began. Then emerged the Shanghai Conference, Shanghai Dialogue, comprising of Russia and China. Slowly, tensions began to brew between China and the USA, especially during the COVID crisis, and the Chinese aggressive attitudes towards Taiwan. And the US-China détente, which had begun with the ping-pong diplomacy of Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger, began to fade. And China once again began to move closer to Russia. Subsequently, other regional groupings, the European Union emerged for the European nations, and other regional groupings also emerged, thereby emphasizing the transformation of the world from a unipolar to a weak bipolar and now to a multipolar world. As today, we find that the nations follow their diplomatic and foreign policies dictated by their own national interests. They are no longer servants to their ideology or blind followers of one power block or the other. That is a thing of the past. तो दोस्तों ये आपका मेन बॉडी हो गया. अब आइए कंक्लूजन. कंक्लूजन भी अबाउट 100 to 120 वर्ड्स का होना चाहिए एंड आई हियर बाई कंक्लूड. In the changed global situation, India is in a position to follow its own strategic interests. Ideologically, we have ushered in an era of globalization and liberalization. Multilateral treaty organizations and treaty obligations and organizations like the World Trade Organization are of immense importance to India, especially in its views on trade in intellectual property rights, TRIPS, and trade in investment measures, TRIMS. India has to keep an open and vigilant eye in climate change conventions, global warming fora, energy transformations, restructuring of the United Nations Organization, the recently advised trade tariffs by a maverick US president, etc. All these things, which are the frontier development of foreign policies in today's world, have to be kept in mind by India so that it can easily and better maneuver in the complex geopolitical and geostrategic situations of the world today. Only then India will maturely negotiate its own interests and utilize global diplomacy and change geostrategic conditions to its advantage so that the country may emerge stronger and better in the future. Thank you for the session. Thank you for the class. We will be once again together for another day. Thank you.